Thank you for returning to my channel, Anthracite Horror Stories. This is a different type of incident that occurred, multiple fatalities for sure, as this one unfortunately affected very young boys, and also it occurred on the surface. So quickly, I'm just going to show you via old postcards what we'll be hearing about. This occurred on an anthracite coal breaker. And that is a coal breaker on the left-hand side with a superstructure on the right, which acted as a trestle from the shaft head frame to the breaker to deliver the coal from the vertical haulage shaft to dump to the top of the breaker for processing. And you'll see why I'm showing the trestle. To the right side of the butler colliery is a trestle there. Unfortunately, the breaker burned in tonight's story. This is a postcard showing the burning of an anthracite coal breaker from a various disaster. And here are a few breaker boys. Actually, this would be mule handlers, so they called them drivers back in the day. And these were just little boys. That was actually, believe it or not, a real photo. And back then they would colorize it through hand coloring. These are just little boys. Little boys and old men. When men would become too old and or injured, they would end up working in the breaker again. So they would say you would start working in the breaker as a young boy, work underground in the mines as a man, and as an old man, return back to the breaker. And here, unfortunately, is the young boys sitting in their workstations picking slate from the coal. On the far left, that was the breaker boss who would have the whip, and he would whip the young boys. You can see he's holding a stick. This guy on the left would whip these children. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds. Whip them. Actually whip them. Absolutely vicious. So tonight's story deals with these little boys here that were in their workstations when this disaster struck and led to the fatalities. Here's one last piece of Delaware and Hudson Coal Company. That's one of their breakers. So hopefully I don't fall through the floor of my second level of my old hay barn here, because that would be bad. Not much gets done up here. I have to restore it, so again, it's a little sketchy up here, because I might be a fatality here. This comes from the New York Times, 1872. Fatal mining disaster. The Lackawanna breaker blown down and burned. 5 persons killed and another not expected to live. From our own correspondent. Scranton, Tuesday, April 2, 1872. To prevent an accident in or about a coal mine is almost an impossibility. Outside the breaker, towering to an altitude of 100 to 150 feet above the mouth of the shaft or slope, the breaker, constructed entirely of timber, becomes in time as dry as tinder, and liable from the least cause to be consumed by fire or to be blown down by a heavy gust of wind. Inside of the mine, the accumulation of gas, the fall of top coal, and premature blasts makes it a dangerous place for men to be employed in. Still, hundreds and thousands of men and boys are found ready and willing to engage in the risky work of digging and bringing coal from the mine. Constantly, the news is heralded of some unfortunate miner losing his life or being terribly injured, the last of which occurred yesterday afternoon during the prevalence of a tornado. The scene of the present disaster was the Lackawanna breaker, half a mile from Carbondale and 16 miles from this city, which was Scranton. It is the property and worked by the Delaware and Hudson Coal Company, which road passes in close proximity to the mine. It is a slope, the cars running into the mine by a gradual descent. The breaker is situated about 200 feet from the mouth of the slope, the intervening space being spanned over by a huge trestle work, planked over and a narrow railway laid on top, over which the cars filled with coal were drawn and emptied into the breaker preparatory to being prepared for market. There are about 20 men and boys employed on the trestle work and the upper portion of the breaker. It was considered safe and was, to all appearances, substantially built. A gale has been blowing in the Ohio Valley since Saturday evening. Its ferocity, however, was not felt until yesterday afternoon. At that time, it was a dangerous experiment to walk the streets. While the gale was at its height, those who were at work at the Lackawanna breaker toiled away, not apprehensive of any imminent danger. At 2 o'clock, while the cars were rapidly going to and fro, some filled and others empty, while a few men were getting the cars into position on the scales so that the miner might be paid his just dues, and while busy little boys with lighted lamps on their caps were preparing to descend into the mine, without a moment's warning, a gust of wind lifted the structure completely from its foundation and hurled it into the deep chasm below, fully 100 feet, carrying with it the trestle work and the upper portion of the breaker. There was a loud crash, so loud that the people of Carbondale heard it distinctly. When the disaster was fully realized, hundreds and thousands flocked to the locality. In the meantime, the debris began to blaze, having caught from the culm pile on which it was now resting. A rickety hand engine was brought to the ground. Hundreds of willing men went to work to rescue the poor creatures who were buried underneath. Their cries were heart-rending, and the scene at this moment among the friends and relatives of the unfortunate victims was indescribable. The air was filled with their groans and wailings. Only half an hour elapsed before the first victim was taken out, a little boy named Henry Palmer, who was horribly mangled and dead. Thomas Fagan, a boy, was next taken away, terribly burned, and his skull was broken in by falling timbers. These two bodies presented a ghastly spectacle. Dwight Morse, John T. Clark, W. H. Palmer, and Henry Jones were taken out terribly burned and crushed by timbers, but life was not extinct. The three former expired at an early hour this morning, and Jones is not expected to survive until this evening. 16 others were taken out, but were more scarred than hurt, and are today in full possession of their health and strength. ERW, the New York Times, New York, New York, April 3, 1872. Again, there goes the media, very graphic, talking about their crushing skulls and mangled bodies. I mean, they really had no shame back then. Say what you want about the media today, and they're pretty awful today, but at least they don't use adjectives like that for the most part. But this breaker actually was lifted and thrown and caught on fire. And see, back then the culm piles were ablaze because a lot of culm had a lot of anthracite, a lot of fine-sized coal, and they would just catch on fire through various reasons. So these culm piles would be infernos, and they would burn for many decades. Carbondale actually had a big mine fire up until, I believe, the 60s, 50s or 60s. But unfortunately, these little boys were the victim of tonight's story, and they should be remembered. God bless their souls. Thank you for watching.